This computer. Welcome everyone to Bodies and Being and our monthly online speaker series. I'm quite excited to welcome Mara Watling today, who is going to be talking about old age and infirmity in dialogue, as you can see on the screen there. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about who we are, what we do. So we are a scholarly collective here at Bodies and Being. We have a little tagline that says the pre-modern body project. So we're very interested in historical research that and literary and other kinds of research that pertain to pre-modern bodies in some way. And all of us in the collective do different things, and our speakers do all kinds of different things. So this is broadly construed. And we exist mainly to provide an accessible outlet for scholars to get their research out to literally anyone who is interested. We believe the humanities belong to the people, so let's invite the people to come and experience some of what we're doing on the academic side. So if you are here and you're not an academic, feel free to just ask questions, do whatever, interact in whatever ways you need to do. So without further ado, Mara Watling is a second-year PhD student at Durham University, and her thesis is about the influence of John of Wales' preaching manuals on Middle English literature. She is also interested in the depiction of illness and aging in late medieval literature. Her research also includes a digital humanities dimension. She's training a Transkribus AI model to transcribe one of John's preaching manuals. Very cool. Prior to her PhD, she completed an MST in medieval literature at the University of Oxford, where her dissertation was about 12th-century conceptions of selfhood as seen through a modern cognitive narratological lens. As someone with multiple disabilities, she is also a disability advocate and always striving for high inclusion standards in all her roles and academic activities. That sounds fantastic. And without further ado, welcome, Mara. Take it away.
Thank you very much, Autumn. I'll try to share my screen now. Is it working?
Yeah, you just have to put it in present mode because we can see the
Yeah. Okay.
so yeah, we can see it.
Okay. And are they moving okay?
Absolutely.
All right. Okay. So again, thank you very much for inviting me to talk and for the very nice introduction. Um, so Today I will talk about oh, by the way, sorry, question. Can you guys see my cursor?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, just so I know whether I should use it. Okay, so today I'll talk about the way in which the Communiloquium, a preaching manual from the 1280s, was used by Chaucer as a source for the Merchant's Tale in the context of a preacher's advice for old age and infirmity. So John's Communiloquium is a pastoral manual of exemplar for use in sermons, and until now it has never been connected to the Merchant's Tale. I will compare John's treatment of aging and bodily decline with Chaucer's mordant portrait of January, the tale's elderly protagonist, to show that he systematically repurposed honest moral instruction into comic satire. Where John advises self-restraint and humility in old age, Chaucer gives us a lecherous old man clinging to youthful folly, heightening irony and dramatic tension. The parallels in themes and phrasing suggest direct influence, yet Chaucer's approach to the material creates distinctly satirical effects. My argument is also supported by new manuscript evidence. I have identified a previously unrecorded scribal error in a copy of the Communiloquium by that Robert Pratt predicted when studying The Wife of Bath's prologue. And this is a further link of Chaucer's links to the Communiloquium. But before we get into all that, I do want to say that there's a trigger warning. there will be discussions of non-consensual sex and the practice of elderly men marrying teenage girls in a historical context. So please feel free to skip this talk and leave at any point if these topics are distressing to you. Okay, I'm going to start now. So, first of all, who was John of Wales? He was a Franciscan scholar who was active in 13th century Oxford in Paris. Born between 1210 and 1230, he was the sixth Franciscan lector at Oxford, sometime after 1258, we're not entirely sure. And Archbishop Peckham's ambassador to Llewellyn, Regent Master of Theology in Paris, and a member of the commission investigating Jean-Peter Olivier in the 1280s. John's works were ridiculously popular during the late Middle Ages, with a total of 604 surviving manuscript copies of all his individual texts, and of those, 144 are of the Communiloquium alone. For context, the Canterbury Tales have about 80 surviving copies, so the Communiloquium was huge. We also have 14 separate early printed editions of his various works, as well as 9 medieval translations of one of his shorter works into 4 vernacular languages, and 1 Old Catalan translation of the Communiloquium itself, which was his longest work and is the one that we're talking today. John's work is particularly significant to literary history, not just because of what he chose to talk about, but because of how he chose to do it. In developing a distinctive approach to the transmission and organization of knowledge, he also contributed to the development of a very distinct literary style, the compilative aesthetics, that are so characteristic of Middle English writers that came after John, such as Chaucer, Gower, and Hoccleve. John was a prominent Franciscan scholar towards the end of the golden age of the mendicant friars. Preaching was the raison d'etre of all the major mendicant orders, who responded to the concerns raised by the Fourth Lateral Council in 1215, where the widespread inadequacy of parish priests, few of whom were sufficiently educated to offer doctrinal instruction, was a very important topic. The council therefore sanctioned bishops to appoint men who could fulfill the office of holy preaching, who shall diligently visit the flock committed to them on the bishop's behalf. The friars, therefore, were fulfilling a very important perceived need. Their main concern was to reach the laity with the message of salvation, and in their attempts to do this, they made an important contribution to the art of preaching. They developed new techniques suited to the audience, such as the use of exempla, which are short stories designed to convey a simple truth rather than through learned discourse. So they made information more accessible to everyone. They produced handbooks of exempla and preaching manuals, and using these, they exhorted or advised men and women to good behavior and repentance. One such collection of exempla, and one of the most popular of its times, is the Communiloquium. So let's look a bit closer. Oh, by the way, this isn't John. This is Saint Francis. Sadly, there are no surviving depictions of John, but he was a Franciscan, so I chose that. So let's talk a bit about the Communiloquium in more detail. Here we can see an outline of the main chapters of the Communiloquium. So, like I said, it is a collection of exempla, and these exempla are organized thematically. Part 1 is about the political commonwealth, so the republic, and it is a bog standard mirror for princes, constructed around the body politic metaphor. Not that new, honestly. Part 2 is when it gets good. It is about bonds that hold people together, so social and household order. So, for example, your relationship with your spouse, your relationship with your servants, your relationship with your children, and so on. Part 3 is the instruction for everyone by category of person. And the categories are gender, age, rank, wealth, moral condition, state of virginity, fortune or luck, and bodily condition. Part 4, the ecclesiastical commonwealth. So it's advice to clerics and church governance. This one is a bit short because actually John went on to write a whole other treatise on this. Part 5 is on education, advice for students and for teachers, and it tells teachers not to abuse their students, which is good. Part 6, it is about conduct in religious life, both monastic and for friars. And part 7, it is about the preparation for death and care for the dying. The ones that we're going to discuss today are part 7, preparation for death, where we're going to discuss John's advice to very old people, but also to people who are ill. And we're also going to discuss part 3, where, again, he gives advice to people who are ill, but not necessarily dying. So the Communiloquium was written in the 1260s. And like I said, it is a very, very vast handbook for preachers. It is about this thick. Maybe not, maybe like that. Crammed with extracts from a wide variety of sources. Preachers' handbooks were a very popular type of work in the 13th century, and we have several written in the same form as the Communiloquium, where different groups in society are addressed according to their status. But each author decides to create these subdivisions in a slightly different way, which is quite an interesting thing to look at. So why was the Communiloquium written? John provides a ready answer. He expresses his purpose clearly in his prologue. The evangelical preacher, John says, ought to be able to instruct all people and to advise them effectively, not only in declamatory preaching, but also in like friendly, casual conversation. And he ought to admonish them according to their age and status and circumstances, as the apostles taught the people of God. One of the ways in which John sought to make preachers' sermons more appealing and accessible was through the use of exempla, which are the mini stories that are meant to prove a small point. And in John's case, they're usually taken from classical authors, the Bible, or patristical texts. Incidentally, it was these exempla that made the Communiloquium so incredibly popular as a source for vernacular writers such as Chaucer and Christine de Pizan, because it gave them access to a very wide variety of knowledge in a relatively condensed form. It was not unlike our modern Wikipedia in that by reading it, you could sound a lot more widely read than you actually were. However, because it was such an accessible source, it's also very rarely cited because you don't really want to cite Wikipedia in your essay, do you? So, but anyways, its accessibility is one of the reasons why the Communiloquium was so massively popular in late medieval times, with 144 manuscript copies, a complete Old Catalan translation, and numerous early printed editions surviving. And it even made it on the list of Cosimo de' Medici's essential books in an ideal library. So, the Communiloquium has been identified as a possible source for several of the Canterbury Tales already. Today, I'm proposing it as a source for an additional tale, the Merchant's Tale. But already, Robert Pratt identified it as a source for the prologue and tale of the Wife of Bath, the Summoner's Tale, and Pardoner's Tale. Neil Cartledge identified it as a source for the Cook's Tale, and Glending Olson identified it as a source for the Physician's Tale. Others have also identified it as a source for Christine de Pizan, a manual on chess, and Robert Holcott. But what matters more than just source spotting is to retain awareness that the Communiloquium, while extremely popular and well circulated among late medieval audiences, was part of an extremely vast tradition of homiletic materials that were in circulation. These materials are often very similar to each other in content, but stand out in the routines of argument and sequences of imagery that they introduced in the cultural zeitgeist. And it is through through the introduction of these routines and sequences that, like Robert Pratt argues, it is clear that if not in this precise volume in the Communiloquium, then probably a close relative, whether progenitor, cousin, or descendant, supplied Chaucer with raw materials for some of his brilliant passages of characterization. So, alone, the correspondences about aging bodies that I'm about to discuss do not prove that Chaucer's use of the Communiloquium was real as a source for the Merchant's Tale. However, the similarities we will discuss should be seen alongside other stronger connections surrounding the other themes in this tale, and the fact that Chaucer is known to have used the Communiloquium for, like I said, the wife of Bath's prologue and tale. It builds the case to establish Chaucer's use for John in the Merchant's Tale as well. Robert Pratt evidenced Chaucer's extensive use of the Communiloquium section on marriage for the wife of Bath's tale and prologue in one of his articles. In addition to that, I have also discovered an extra manuscript evidence to support Pratt's idea that Chaucer used the Communiloquium section on marriage as a direct source for the wife of Bath's prologue. When discussing whether Chaucer used John of Wales, Valerius Maximus, or Julius Paris as a source for Alice's discussion of her fifth husband, Pratt says that, and I quote, John of Wales accounts for practically everything. The only problem lies in the fact that both Valerius Maximus and Julius Paris read capite aperto, and Chaucer reads open-headed, whereas John of Wales, at least in the 1489 edition, reads capite non-coaperto. This, of course, may be a variant in the text of the Communiloquium itself. If so, it should help the identification of the class of manuscript used by Chaucer or of the treatise if it was a different one. End quote. And I found exactly that. I've solved Pratt's problem by finding a manuscript copy of the Communiloquium from 1409 that features capite aperto, and you can see it here. See? Capite aperto. Suggesting that at least one manuscript branch of the Communiloquium contains the correct capite aperto line, and it was in circulation at the time when Chaucer wrote the tales, or suggesting that the capite coaperto mistake might have been introduced in the manuscript edition sometime after 1409, in time to make it into the copy that Pratt looked at, which is from 1489. Either option allows for the possibility that Chaucer had access to a Communiloquium copy containing capite aperto, making it likely that Chaucer did indeed use the Communiloquium section on marriage as the primary source for the wife of Bath's prologue. Incidentally, in the Communiloquium, the capite aperto line comes less than 16 lines after the pinching shoe line from Jerome that is also present in the Merchant's Tale. And this makes it even more likely that Chaucer was aware of and used this line from John as a source for the Merchant's Tale. There are other arguments. He actually mentions some stuff that's not in Jerome, but we won't have time to go into that. In addition to that, Chaucer reused the pinching shoe line in the wife of Bath's prologue. And it seems unlikely that Chaucer, having used this Communiloquium section for the wife of Bath, wouldn't use the Communiloquium at all for the merchant. Now, let's focus on the Merchant's Tale. We're going to do a quick recap in case not everyone is a literary historian. So, The Merchant's Tale is a story about the classic dynamic of the love triangle between a lecherous, jealous old husband, the Senex Amans, and his young wife and her young lover. The first part of the tale is effectively a debate about the merits and drawbacks of taking a wife, especially when you're an old man. January is an old knight who's been around the block once or twice. And I quote, "And 60 years a wifeless man was he, and followed all his bodily delight. On women there was his appetite. Who decided to take a wife, were it for holiness or for dotage, I cannot say. He calls his friends Placebo and Justinus, and tells them of his great decision to take a young wife in order to have heirs and spend his final days in peace, prosperity, and marital bliss, which, of course, for him includes sin-free intercourse. Placebo, true to his name, praises January for his brilliant decision, while Justinus tells him that he is rash and too old for a young wife. January ignores his second friend and marries May, a beautiful young girl. The wedding scene is honestly gruesome. I genuinely don't recommend reading it unless you have to. But after the whole thing is over, May falls in love with January's squire, Damien. Soon, January becomes blind and he becomes obsessed that May will sleep with another man. So he entraps May and always has a hand on her. The two youths conspire to consummate their love by climbing into a pear tree. But as they are enjoying their time in the pear tree, Pluto, the king of the fairies, restores January's sight so that January catches the two in the act. However, May, with cunning given to her by Proserpina, convinces him that she knew his eyes could be cured if she struggled with a man up a tree, and convinces him to be grateful to her. The ultimate message of the tale is that wives, especially young ones, are not worth the pain. Or that's at least the message that the merchant is trying to give us. The tale is split into 3 sections. So 1, January's deliberations on marriage. 2, the wedding to May and the understanding between May and Damien. And 3, the deception story with the pear tree. The first part, the marriage debate, has so far been identified as having Le Mirage de Mariage by Eustache de Champs and Jerome's Epistola Adversus Jovinianum as its main sources. Even though I won't have time to discuss that today, I have also found passages that strongly indicate the Communiloquium was used as a source for the tale's theme of sycophancy and good advice that are present in this first part of the tale. Part 3, the deception story with the pear tree, has numerous sources, but overall its closest source, its structure is closest to the Italian novella, the Novellino, one of many Italian and Arabic sources that contain the scene with the pear tree being used as an aid for cuckolding one's husband. Today, we're focusing on part 2, and namely on January's wedding to May. This section has been identified as having 2 Boccacian sources, Decameron 210 and the Comedy of the Florentine Nymphs. However, I will argue that there is an important difference between Chaucer and Boccaccio that can be explained by Chaucer's use of John alongside Boccaccio. I'm arguing that the Communiloquium is one of the compilative homiletic works that shaped the patterns of what N.S. Thompson calls the diffuse argument in circulation at the time, which include the Senex Ammons theme, and which have been used as more diffuse sources than the direct sources of the Decameron, for example. So, let's talk about Chaucer's divergence from Boccaccio and move towards John. He diverges from the Boccaccian sources in one crucial way. January, his Senex Ammons, is gluttonous for both food and drink, but especially drink, and lustful. And indeed, his gluttony is presented as encouraging his lust, as we can see in this section. For accessibility reasons, I'm going to read in modern English, and you guys can see on the screen the Middle English. Soon after that, the wedding ceremony, this hasty January would go to bed. He would no longer tarry. He drinks mulled wine, claret, and strong white wine, with hot spices to increase his desire, and many a fine aphrodisiac has he, such as the coursed monk Dan Constantine has written in his book concerning intercourse. To eat them all he is not at all averse. In Decameron 210, Messer Ricardo, the Senex Amans, is impotent and does not experience lust for his wife, or for life for that matter, which is the reason she refuses to return to him. He also does not experience gluttony. By contrast, January is, as John puts it, a child in morals at 100 years, who is excessively lustful for May and consummate their marriage successfully, although not pleasantly to her, multiple times. In the other Boccaccian source, the Comedy of the Florentine Nymphs, the Senex Aman does feel lust for his wife, but he is unable to successfully consummate the marriage. From here, Chaucer does borrow the Senex Amans' physical descriptions as presented from the young wight's point of view, but unlike January, this Senex Amans is also not gluttonous. Sorry, I have celiac disease, so I say the word gluten a lot, which is why I struggle to say gluttonous. Okay, so we've established that there's a difference between Boccaccio and Chaucer in that Chaucer's Senex Amans is gluttonous, which leads to lechery. This association between gluttony and lust is recurrent in John's Communiloquium in passages such as these. The apostle says a bishop must not be given to wine, nor a scoffer or reveler, for the belly heated by wine quickly foams up into lust. In wine there is sensuality, in sensuality there is pleasure, and in pleasure there is impurity. Another one. Especially must women be admonished to be sober and moderate in food, and to beware of drunkenness, because Valerius says, in older times, the use of wine was unknown amongst Roman women, namely, lest they fall into some disgrace, for from Bacchus to intemperance there is a short step leading on to unlawful lust. And then the last one, citing Jerome, wine and youth, a double flame of pleasure. Why add oil to the fire? Why supply fuel for flames to an already burning fire? A moderate meal, never a belly full or gorged. That's what he's recommending for young people, but it does also apply to old people. So, as we can see, there is a line of influence from John to Chaucer about the association of gluttony, specifically for wine, and lust that is not present in Boccaccio. So that's the distinction between Chaucer and Boccaccio that can be explained through John. Now let's talk about the similarities between Chaucer and John that have nothing to do with Boccaccio. So here I have summarized John's advice for old and or sick men. Like I said earlier, it is from the final section of the Communiloquium and from the one that splits people into various parts of society. So, Chaucer weaves pieces of homiletic advice from John throughout his Canterbury Tales, as we discussed already. Sometimes these pieces are cited directly, like in the Capite Aperto situation, and the extensive quoting in the Wife of Bath prologue and tale that Robert Pratt discovered. Other times, Chaucer weaves John's exemplar and pieces of advice into the narrative of a tale, with Jonian elements informing the tale's themes and his characters' behaviors, as Neil Cartledge demonstrates that was likely the cause for the Cook's Tale. Here we have the seven themes that John reiterates repeatedly in his sections on advice for old men, the sick, and the unfortunate. Most of these points are repeated ad nauseam in John. So I'll only provide one or two examples, but believe me, there's way more. So these are: 1. Old men should be thankful for their failing health, because it means it is harder for them to sin. 2. Becoming blind is an opportunity to enrich one's soul and one's faith. 3. Wise men are not jealous or scared of losing their possession and health because they know that everything worldly is temporary and foolish to value. Of course, a kind of vanitas vanitatis. 4. Old men should not desire what they did in their youth or childhood. 5. Old men should prepare for their death by having fewer worldly desires, avoiding sin, and cultivating their faith. 6. Old men should be wise and virtuous. And 7. Old men should continually expand their learning and wisdom for as long as they are able. So kind of like the modern idea of lifelong learning. We're going to see that for every single one of these recommendations from John, Chaucer turns it on its head so that January does the exact opposite. So now we'll look at each of these recommendations and see how Chaucer deploys it inverted in the Merchant's Tale. So the first one, old men should be thankful for their failing health because it means it's harder for them to sin. The John passage says that, likewise, the elderly must be admonished, being in old age, which is called senior according to Papias, so that just as their temporal bodily age has grown, so too their age of virtue may grow, and that at this age all youthful pleasures be cast aside. For as Tully says On Old Age, a splendid gift of this age is that it removes from us what is most vicious in youth, pleasure. Yeah, I don't think they were very fun people. But now let's look at a Chaucer passage that uses this theme. And also this Chaucer passage can also be applied to the next two themes. So we're going to keep coming back to it. O sudden chance, O thou fortune unstable, why hast thou January thus deceived? Thou who hast received him for thy closest friend, and now thou hast deprived him of both his eyes, for sorrow of which he desires to die. Alas, this noble, generous January, amid his pleasure and his prosperity, is grown blind, and that all suddenly. He weeps and he wails pitifully, and with all this, the fire of jealousy, lest that his wife should fall in some folly, so burned his heart that he sincerely wished that some man both her and him had slain. So, as we can see, January is really not taking his poor health well. Psychologically, he's very traumatized by it. He is clearly not thankful for growing blind. As we can see here, he is weeping and wailing, and he's losing his mind with jealousy, and yeah, he's basically just grieving the loss of his eyes instead of doing what John would recommend, which is being thankful. Next is, again, along the same lines, that becoming blind should be an opportunity to enrich one's soul and one's faith. And John says that just as sickness of the body is cured by a great and strong remedy, so through the sickness of the body, the vices of the soul are cut off. And this is a great virtue when, in infirmities, there is endurance, and they are sent up to God with thanksgiving. If we lose our eyes, let us not bear it with heaviness. Then he keeps giving examples of other senses that we can lose. And this is an agreement with what is read in Book 3 of the Tripartite History about St. Anthony speaking to Didymus, who, when he was very young, lost his eyes, and to whom God granted spiritual ones in place of the visible. It is said that Anthony said to him, "Do not be troubled over the loss of bodily eyes, for you lack those by which flies and fleas can be avoided, but rejoice rather than you have those by which angels are recognized and our God is beheld." So very clearly, like I said, going back to that section from Chaucer, January is very distressed, as most people in real life would be at going blind. He is losing it. He wants to die out of sorrow. He weeps, he wails, and he goes mad with jealousy. And certainly he is not enriching his soul or improving his faith. Next is the advice that wise men are not jealous or scared of losing their possessions or health because they know that everything worldly is temporary and foolish to have. And John says that Seneca proves in the same place that the wise man can lose nothing, for he has put everything away, having entrusted nothing to fortune. He holds his goods in the solid, content with virtue, which he has no need of chance events. And therefore he concludes that injustice cannot be done to the wise man. Therefore, those who endure adversities must be admonished to bear them patiently and consider that adversity does not take away true goods and restrains from evil, namely lusts, and cleanses from sins, and heaps up rewards, especially when they bear them patiently in faith for God's sake, as Scripture testifies throughout. By the way, if any of the translations are slightly off, it's on me. Sadly, there's currently no English translation, or actually any modern translation of John. Okay, so here we see again, wise men who are wise should be very stoic and not care about worldly things that can disappear as you're moving down on the wheel of fortune. And we can very much see this again in the same passage from Chaucer in terms of January's attachment both to his sight, which is a worldly possession that you can lose at any point, but also in his attachment to May, in his jealous obsession to keep him to himself, because the way he objectifies his wife makes him forget that he could lose her at any point, just as he could use anything else that he thinks he owns. So that's yet another example of January doing the absolute opposite of what John recommends. Next, so John also recommends that men should not desire what they did to do what they did in their youth or their childhood. And John says that the task of such elderly people is that vices die in them before they themselves die. As Seneca says, let the vices die in you first. Put aside shameful pleasures. Count your years. You'll be ashamed to will the same things you willed as a boy, to plan the same things. Indeed, these must be the works of an old man, to reject what he wanted as a boy, and to die well. I formed myself before old age, so that I might live well in my old age, and from that, that I might die well. But if he not be such, he is a child in morals at 100 years. And Isaiah 65, the child of 100 years shall die, as Gregory Moralia 8 explains. For there is nothing more shameful than an old man beginning to live, as Seneca says in Epistle 18. It is too late to begin living when one must stop living. Indeed, it must be the endeavor of old men to cast off all past pleasures, to recall constantly former sins and failings, to ponder over their trials in old age. For as Gregory says in the Gospel, in that age, the body's frame is bowed, the neck dried out with frequent sighs, and the chest is oppressed. Strength fails, and the speaker's words are cut off by panting. This description actually also reflects a description in Chaucer, which I forgot to include in this presentation. Apologies. But yes, so as we can see, John essentially says the same thing about 6 or 7 times, that old men should not have the desires that young people and children have. And especially they should not have the desires that they had in their youth, in their own youth. And again, January does the absolute opposite. And 60 years a wifeless man was he, and followed always his bodily desire. On women there was his appetite, as do these fools that are secular. And when he was past 60 years, were it for holiness or for dotage, I cannot say, but such a great desire had this knight to be a wedded man. And then we go on about how much he wants to marry. Then should he take a young wife and a fair, one which he might engender himself an heir, and lead his life in joy and pleasure. So very clearly in this upper section, we have his former desires when he was young. He liked women, he liked sex and that kind of stuff. And then after he turns 60, it is very, very clearly stated that he hasn't changed. He still likes the same things. So he does exactly the opposite of what John recommends here, that you should not desire the same things you desired in your youth. Next, John advises that old men should prepare for death by having fewer worldly desires, avoiding sin, and cultivating faith. And he says that I will most gladly boast in my infirmities of mind and of body, in the manner stated, so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Again, sorry, 1 second, I lost my place. Yes, okay. Again, January does the absolute opposite. This is a scene immediately after the wedding ceremony with May. Soon after that, this hasty January would go to bed. He would no longer tarry. He drinks mulled wine, claret, and strong white wine, with hot spices to increase his desire, and many a fine aphrodisiac has he, such as the cursed monk, Dan Constantine, has written in his book concerning intercourse. To eat them all, he was not at all averse. And then we go on about how he gets May into bed. Then the initial consummation happens, and then we have this section. Thus labors he in bed until the day dawned, and when he takes a bit of bread soaked in fine claret, and bright in his bed, and upright in his bed, then sits he, and after that he sang full loud and clear, and kissed his wife, and acted letters. So very clearly in this section, January is gluttonous with all the wines and all that. He is lustful with the repeated consummation of the marriage on the very first night, and his almost like greed for May. So as we can see, he is really not avoiding sin. He has as many worldly desires as he's ever had, and he's not cultivating faith. I'm pretty sure he doesn't, he probably doesn't even remember about faith at this point. So once again, he is acting absolutely the opposite to what John recommends. The next recommendation is that old men should be wise and virtuous, which we know January really isn't. So John says that, as Ambrose says in the first Hexameron, old age is gentler in good morals, more useful in counsel, readier to undergo the steadfastness of death, and stronger to restrain lusts. Charlie likewise says that the weapons of old age are the arts and exercises of virtue. So Hopefully by now I've already shown through the earlier passages that January is nothing close to virtuous. As for being wise, first, the narrator often uses irony when January is saying something very naive or something simply stupid. So for example, here the narrator calls him very wise. Um, no other life, said he, is worth a bean, for wedlock is so easy and so pure, that in this world it is a paradise. Thus said this old knight who was so wise. So, you can really feel the irony there. But aside from this irony from the narrator, um, we also see that January is placed in opposition to Justinus, who provides true wisdom and promotes rational thinking. He actually says to January, a man ought very carefully to consider marriage. And January just gets mad. He not only fails to provide coherent arguments and philosophical wisdom like his friend does, but he also fails to recognize the value of his friend's advice and opts for placebo's flattery. The next advice from John is that old men should continually expand their learning and wisdom. And John says, what is more foolish than not learning for a long time, nor being willing to learn? The school admits men at every age. Let us grow old in it. We must learn as long as we are ignorant. And if we trust the proverb, as long as you live, nor can anything more equitable be suited than this. And please note that John says specifically this specifically in the subchapter on on advice for the elderly. So he really does think that old people should have this lifelong learning, which, of course, January really doesn't do. So aside from rejecting Justinus's advice, January fails to expand his learning by refusing to engage at all with Justinus's arguments. Instead of entering into a debate with his friend, January calls for help from his other sycophantic friend, Placebo, who simply agrees with him and effectively ends the debate altogether. And this is again what January says. Straw for thy Seneca and for thy proverbs. I would not give a bread basket full of herbs for academic talk. Wiser man than you, as you have heard, assented right now to my purpose. Placebo, what say you? That's kind of like Placebo, help me out. So as we've seen, there are many instances where there are strong thematic overlaps between the Merchant's Tale and the 3 chapters from the Communiloquium, which cover old age, sickness, and ill fortune. These overlaps must be viewed in the wider context of other, admittedly stronger, textual correspondences between the Merchant's Tale and John's sections of anti-matrimonial arguments and sycophancy, which sadly I don't have time to go into today. Moreover, as I mentioned in the beginning, there are ever stronger indicators that Chaucer made heavier use than previously thought of the Communiloquium as a source for his Canterbury Tales in general, particularly in the Wife of Bath's prologue and tale. So, returning to the Merchant's Tale specifically, so far we've been tiptoeing around a very crucial question. Is January actually old? He's 60, which to us isn't old at all, but to a medieval audience, he would have been either approaching or securely within old age. Even though medieval medical definitions of old age vary, with some writers placing its onset at 35 years of age and others at 70, the span of life allotted to man in the Bible in Psalm 89:10, the days of our years in them are 70 years, or at 75. According to Galen, old age starts at around 60 and is an inevitable progressive condition of wasting, which he likens to oil gradually being used up by the flame in an oil lamp, and he attributes it to a loss of moisture and heat. And indeed, both Boccaccio and Chaucer frequently call their old men dry and cold. Some scholars have stated that old people were an unusual anomaly during the medieval period, with Sarah Anderson arguing that though the Senex might well be instantiated and encountered plentifully in literary and philosophical writing, he's a much rarer figure in the actual life and history of the Middle Ages. So, she's saying that old people were very rare. However, more recent scholarship has revealed that elders were a far more common occurrence than previously thought during the Middle Ages. Um, Indeed, according to Deborah Youngs, between 1300 and 1500, if one made it past infancy and early childhood, because under seven mortality was a whopping 30%, but if you make it past that, uh, and you live past seven, you are quite likely to live quite a relatively long life, with information gathered from London's merchants and peasant societies in the Midlands and southeast of England, suggesting that once you reach 20, men could expect an average life expectancy somewhere in the early 50s. Similar findings can be applied to men in northern Italian city-states in the 15th century. And as is sadly the case today, being well off could give you some extra years in life compared to the working population, with, for example, 31% of the 434 secular peers summoned to the English Parliament between 1350 and 1500 living well beyond 60 years. So, according to the latest research, given the fact that January is a rich knife with a large household who doesn't really seem to do anything all day, it isn't that surprising that he has made it to the age of 60. And yes, he would definitely have been considered old by a medieval audience. And yes, this is a picture from a book of hours. I really didn't know what picture to put on this slide, but I guess I selected one that contained two elderly men. One of them is a Duc de Berry, which at the time was in his 70s. I don't know who that is, but he clearly is old. And yes, this is around from around 1410. And yeah, I said it's a book of hours. Yeah. Okay. So we've talked about whether January actually is or isn't old, and we've agreed that he is. Now let's talk about the Senex Ammons, the old man in love, as a stock character. Ancient Rome bequeathed two tropes about old men, the Senex Ammons and the Papas. The Senex Ammons originates in Roman comedy, especially in the works of Plautus and Terence, where old men are depicted as ridiculous figures marked by inappropriate desire, diminished sexual capacity, and gullibility. In his Ars Poetica, Horace synthesizes this stock character into a broader model of old age, emphasizing traits such as physical weakness, envy of youth, quarrelsomeness, and greed. A player who is all repulsive desire but no action. Because Horace's Ars Poetica became a foundational educational text in the Middle Ages, this stock character was transmitted into medieval literary culture and influenced writers like Chaucer very clearly. Likewise, the Papist trope originates in Roman comedy and represents the easily tricked old father who lacks all foresight and rational command. And I think we can agree that January is both a Papa and a Senex Ammons. Here I found a picture of the myth of Aristotle being ridden by Phyllis, who was one of Alexander the Great's concubines. And I think this picture exemplifies the idea of Senex Ammons very well, because Aristotle is being humiliated by this woman due to his inability to control inappropriate lust for her, and this leads to a loss of rational control and complete gullibility on his side. And there's actually a lot of depictions of this myth. And I think it shows the ubiquity of the Senex Ammon stock character in medieval culture. So across this tradition of the Senex Ammons, the old man emerges as a consistent figure of decline, combining elements of both comic ridicule and moral unease, because their lust is always presented as inappropriate. Chaucer uses these tropes in the exact same way, and he takes these classical stock characters and combines them to create January, with elements from both the lecherous Senex Ammons and the gullible Papas, with the distinction that January is not as impotent as the stock characters usually are. What Chaucer adds to these tropes is that he places them in the context of John's advice about aging, illness, and sinning. The pieces of homiletic advice he takes from John would have been very familiar to Chaucer's original audience, from attending sermons and from their general social circulation and dissipation. He uses the Communiloquium in conjunction with the rest of his source materials to weave a rich tapestry of interconnected stories, exempla, and ideas, whose juxtaposition would have been anything but surprising to a contemporary reader. Like the preachers for whom John wrote his compendium, Chaucer uses the Communiloquium as a reference source among many. And by integrating this classical stock character, the Senex Ammons and the Papa, into contemporary homiletic advice, Chaucer makes January seem more real than his Baccacian counterparts, who are a very bare bones kind of stock character. Rather than just being another soulless representation of this type, January becomes the man that people are warned not to become when they go to church, a plausibly realistic man who is too taken up with satisfying his sinful desires and arrogance to consider his actions, heed his friends, or act his age in accordance with contemporary social and Christian norms. But did January actually deserve his fate in the eyes of Chaucer's contemporary audience? There is poetic justice in January being made a cuckold in his garden because he invited trouble by marrying a woman so much younger than him. But I think it boils down to a lot more than that. January ignores his friend's advice, is gluttonous, lustful, and unwilling to learn. He is unable to accept his own mortality or his frailty. He essentially does everything that Communiloquium and other homiletic materials tell all men not to do. This creates an upside-down world of values, as Will Taylor calls it. Sorry, I lost my spot. Yeah, this creates an upside-down world of values in which May's adultery seems justified by January's many, many moral failings. Aging and death is a ubiquitous topic in medieval literature as a whole, and homiletic literature in particular. So one can't be entirely sure that Chaucer's use of the Communiloquium as a direct source. However, we can deduce a likely connection between the Communiloquium and the Merchant's Tale, based on the thematic presentation when it comes to the topics of aging and illness, and based on closer textual connections when it comes to topics such as marriage and good advice versus flattery. Where John advises self-restraint and humility in old age, Chaucer gives us a lecherous old man clinging to youthful folly, heightening irony and dramatic tension. The thematic parallels, along with stronger correlations in other parts of the tale, suggest direct influence, yet Chaucer's approach to the material creates distinctly satirical effects. Thank you very much for listening. And here is a partial bibliography. I actually couldn't fit everything in here, and I didn't want to make it too small. But yeah, feel free to email me if you have any questions. And thank you once again very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about my research today.
Thank you so much, Mara. That was really, really informative, especially for somebody like me who's an early modernist and doesn't get to dip into this stuff too often. So I'll open it up to questions. I have a couple, but I'll let others go first if they have them. All right. I have questions. Well, one of my questions was going to be, but it was a little bit answered by something else you said. You're talking about John's influence on Chaucer.
Yeah,
I was I was wondering, like, where did John himself get these ideas? And I had an inkling, and I thought Galen clearly. And
yeah.
then you mentioned Galen's age of the old age cutoff, or when it starts, is the age of 60, which is, of
Hmm.
course, exactly what happens in Chaucer's tale there.
Yeah.
So I wondered, would you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, he also talks about, the wine and inspiring lust, which is a very common, like, sort of, humoral theory kind of idea. And I just wondered if you had anything more to say about it, just because Galen shows up in some of my work and I'm selfish.
Yes, so Chaucer's most important, sorry, not Chaucer, John's most important source for a lot of things is actually Valerius Maximus. And I think almost all, if not all, of the bits about wine creating lust are from Valerius Maximus. Um, and yes, I'm actually don't not that well read on Galen, so I don't know if Galen says that wine incites lust. I've only read about Galen specifically in regard to old age. Um,
Yeah.
yes, and I was going to say something else. I lost it. It'll come back to me.
No, that's okay. The reason I asked too is because, of course, Galen is really popularizing and adding to Hippocrates. And so it's
Yeah,
like it's like playing telephone, right? So sometimes it is so
yeah,
hard to remember who inserted what where.
yes,
And of course, by the early modern period, you have this association with food, gluttony, lust, all of that. And so I was just
yeah,
curious because in my limited knowledge of this, I saw Galen at work here. But
yeah. I
yeah,
think
thank
there
you.
might be some Avicenna as well in that.
Oh yeah, okay.
um on this topic. And also, I remember what I wanted to say earlier. Um, John doesn't have that many um medical sources apart from the most popular. But he is of the first generations to include medical sources um in um in advice for preachers because he was at Oxford with the Mendicant friars during the time when they started teaching medical sources for everyone regardless of which thread of education they were on.
That is an interesting bit of information that actually one of my students will be very interested to hear. She is working on sort of um, that how Christians used medical theory and sort of theologized it, I guess. Um,
Yes, yeah, that's a very good way to put
so
it.
like that's she was just asking me about that, and I was like, oh, I don't know. I think this, that, and the other thing, not good enough. This is great. Thank you so much
I
for that.
actually found it out last week, so I can email
I
you
bet you
the
passed it
where I
on.
read it. Yeah.
Pass it on to Canadian students. That's fantastic. Yeah, because it's really odd how Avicenna and people like that, like they didn't necessarily turn it into like a religious, they didn't necessarily moralize a lot of it. And so it's very interesting how humoral theory was received by different different religions and things like that.
Yeah.
So that's really interesting. I had a lot of things I could ask you, but I'll just keep it brief. I was curious about I'm a methodology person and I'm a process person. And I love to hear about these things because I'm a former archivist. This is what I love. Um,
Mm.
how did you decide to connect these two? Did you kind of make that connection through the historiography or reading what others had written about Chaucer's influences? Or were you just jumping along one day and had read both, or all his works and then just sort of made that connection?
Um, well, so no, that's a good question. Um, I knew that I wanted to do my PhD on source studies,
Oh,
and I can't remember the name of the book, but I essentially found a book about um English writers in Latin. Um, and then I stumbled upon, am I still sharing my screen? I don't think I am.
no, it's gone, but
Okay, yeah. So I stumbled upon Robert Pratt's Chaucer and the Hand That Fed Him, um,
yes.
which is kind of like the most important thing ever written on John source studies. Um, and along with Jenny Swanson's book on John, it's kind of like you've read those two things, you have a good
Okay.
foundation. Um, so yes, I stumbled upon Pratt's connection between um, the wife of Bath and John. And then I just kept reading, and my supervisor kept saying, I'm sure there's more in Chaucer. Um, because John is so, um, he's such an accessible author. And the thing with him, like I said in my talk, he is the Wikipedia of the late Middle Ages.
I wrote that down.
And uh, you really don't cite Wikipedia because you read John in order to make it seem like, oh yes, I've read Avicenna and Aristotle and all of those, but no, you haven't. You've just read John. But that's why um, it's so hard to actually trace it back, and it's very much detective work.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. That's great. Yeah, I remembered you talking about I'm sorry, Robert Pratt, was that what you said?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, Robert Pratt. And yeah, I was curious if like, you had just kind of stumbled upon his work and had this question or, but it's interesting to know that you're into source studies. That's a very cool kind of area. I'll limit myself to one more question since there doesn't seem to be any other. Um, and it's maybe related to the last one, but I'm always very curious about where in your work you struggled or found limitations or um, frustrations or, things like that.
Oh, you have really good questions. Um, I think it's how diffuse these arguments are, because I
Mm,
have a lot of moments when I'm reading, Chaucer or Gower or Christine de Pizan, and my light bulb goes up, and I'm like, oh, that sounds like John. Um, but that's also because John was dealing in commonalities. He was like, I pictured John like, you know. Sadly, I'm not one of those people, but I wish I was. People who like use all the latest terms and all the latest memes and all that kind of stuff. That was John in the 1270s. And because he dealt in such popular exemplar and lines of reasoning and stuff like that, it's easy to think you found something but it's actually from a florilegium or from
right.
I don't know, Gregory the Great or something. So I try to construct my arguments. I try to not get too excited and say, yes, it's John, and make a case for it. And with with this, it's often the fact that it's a lot of tiny little clues, but you don't have the big, beautiful, yes, this was something. Um, so yeah, it's a bit death by a thousand cuts.
Yeah, I think you really described the PhD experience in general, but especially I think, yeah, with this with source study, this is truly source studies, because
Yeah.
yeah, like who said it first, we don't really know.
Yeah.
So
Oh,
yeah,
and it's
that's
also hard at the end to say, okay, so what? Why is this relevant? Why does this matter? Why did I spend 2 months doing this?
right.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. No, that's fantastic. That's really great. I've learned a lot and I've come away with a lot of reading suggestions. So thank you so much. And thank you for joining us in our monthly speaker series. We hope
Thank
to
you very much.
some point, especially as you get further along and develop these arguments. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much for giving me a platform to talk about my research.
Absolutely.